We're at the time of the year where we start highlighting the best parts of the most recent season of the Overwatch League, and with teams thinking about who to build their teams around, now seems like a good time to highlight the MVP of every single team. What goes into value is, of course, up to the eye of the beholder. There's a lot of things that go into this, but generally I'll be looking at who individually boosted their team's rate of success the most arguably. It'll come through lots of clutch feats, flexibility, rewards, and anything else that's necessary. And please do keep in mind that being the MVP of the team doesn't necessarily mean they're the best player. It's two different things. A simple video with a lot of room for debate. So be sure to leave your own list down in the comments below and like this video if you enjoyed. Let's change it up and go in descending order of the standings, which means that first will be the Dallas Fuel. They're always a little tough considering they move and play as a total unit, but it's pretty hard to not straight up give this honor to Hanbin. While the playoff meta is not really his cup of tea, it's hard to imagine that Dallas even get the top record in the league to begin with without him. Outside of the 4 games in the playoffs, Dallas was consistently depending on Hanbin to take them as far as they got. He played out of his freaking mind in one of the greatest individual seasons by a tank player of all time. Hanbin led the league in eliminations per 10, and is the only tank player who even sniffs the top in terms of damage. And I mean, when you are definitively the most dominant Zarya and Junker Queen player, and your team basically never lost when you're in the game, it's kind of hard to go against you. Hanbin was a beast, and when you're only getting 3 less MVP votes than somebody like Proper, it's safe to say that your team is getting a lot out of you. Next is the San Francisco Shock, and this one is of course Proper. There's really no one else you can go with. Without Proper, the Shock aren't much of a threat at all. They're a good team, but not a great one. What Proper did in 2022 is one of the greatest hard carry performances in Overwatch history. They literally went as far as he could carry them in tournaments, regular season games, and even more so in the playoffs. The sheer number of fights that this guy turned around in San Fran's favor throughout the year should be illegal. Proper had a total of 9 flooded deadlifts on the year. What's a flooded deadlift, you may ask? It's when a player gets 50% or more of his team's final blows in a single map. In other words, if Proper wasn't killing things, the Shock would lose. Proper is by far the easiest no-brainer on this entire list. The LA Gladiators. This one's a bit more difficult. The Glads had 2 players that were very pivotal towards their success, being Kevster and Shu. But I feel inclined to pick Shu by a very, very slight margin. For starters, we need a little support love in this video. But 2, there came a point in this season where the Glads did not play Shu. He was pretty absent at the support role during the Summer Showdown, but in his absence, the Gladiators posted a pedestrian 2-4 record and missed their only tournament of the entire season. But with Shu in the game at the flex support role, they lost only 2 matches during regular season qualifiers. It's a small sample size without him. Kevster was also really good this year, and the Glads had other reasons for struggling back then, but the fact remains that they were at their most relevant when he was in the starting lineup. This man was the only MVP candidate representing the support position and generally drew a lot of eyes on arguably the least flashiest role in the league, that being support. You can only go so far without an excellent backline presence, and Shu proves it. The Seoul Dynasty. You know, as much as I appreciate Prophet and the year he had, I feel entitled to go with Smurf. First of all, the moment that Seoul ended up signing this guy, they became way better than what we saw in previous years. A good tank was surely the missing piece, but it goes way beyond that, right? As the only tank player on the roster, it was Smurf's responsibility to play at an elite level no matter what the meta called for, and he absolutely smashed expectations. He was incredibly strong on every tank hero he touched, which ultimately gave Seoul that needed flexibility to stay on top of the Eastern Conference. It says a lot about one guy when he can come in and play a bunch of heroes he's never touched professionally before and not miss a single beat. Smurf is just built different. He often did a lot of the dirty work and heavy lifting while still finding ways to stand out and carry his team. Just an excellent player that pushed Seoul to brand new heights. The Shanghai Dragons are up next, and in past years this would obviously be a really hard one, but the only guy who truly stayed in peak form compared to last year's Shanghai core was Lip. He was their real X factor from start to finish, and no one else really compares. In a similar fashion to Proper, the Dragons could only go as far as Lip could carry them. He was arguably the best hit scan in the entire league, and his team needed every single bit of his efforts to even win the Summer Showdown. And sadly, there were times where it felt like he was the only one doing anything at all. Lip's the only guy who even sniffed the MVP conversation on this team, in spite of his team accumulating 23 points in the regular season. That says a lot. The Houston Outlaws, while a shout definitely should go to Merit and even Pelican, this one's gotta go to Dante, a man who was quite arguably robbed of a role star, did a lot for this Houston team. They asked a lot of this man. I mean, they even had him switch roles, and through it all, he still remained a pretty major contributor. They needed him in the game at all times because that's how much his leadership meant to the rest of this group. They preferred Dante over their actual tank players, which says a lot. His Doom was very pivotal to the team early on, and then he transitioned into picking up tons of other heroes he had very little experience on. We literally saw him pick up Winston after 5 days of practice and be somewhat serviceable during the playoffs. That is unreal flexibility. The Outlaws asked this guy to do literally everything under the sun for them, and he stepped up without hesitation. Heading into the Atlanta Reign, this one's more of a toss-up. I'm pretty tempted to go with Ultraviolet for having a pretty nutty year, but it only feels right to go with Hawk. To put it simply, early in the season, the Reign had an identity crisis. Do we play Hawk or Gator? Well, as it turns out, whenever the team subbed Hawk out, they were taking L's. It wasn't until they made Hawk the permanent starter that more consistent results started pouring in. He had the flexibility and the leadership that you want to build your team around, and aside from Winston, he was pretty darn solid. Coaching has even come out and said that he gave them the best chances to win. Like, what else do you need to hear? Now we're going to move on to the London Spitfire, and you already know that we're going with Hottie. There were multiple metas where this team chose to play around him and him alone. They invested in him to lead them to the promised land, and he delivered with some excellent performances. And what's great about Hottie is his value just goes way beyond the in-game stuff. He also happens to be a really positive figurehead. He's a leader in and out of the game, and he's someone that his teammates look up to. As the Dennis Avelko Award winner, he does a lot to keep his team in the right place mentally. He leads them in every way imaginable, and they gladly follow him. It takes a lot of trust to so willingly follow one man, which goes to show just how much Hottie meant to the London Spitfire in 2022. The Florida Mayhem. The Mayhem had a really solid team effort, lots of great contributors all around. But for me, it's someone who sticks out the most. He's a combination of Hottie and Smurf, but to a lesser extent. As a rookie player with not a lot of experience on the off-tank heroes per se, he showed off insane versatility. He was genuinely a top performer on most tanks in the game, in spite of not having any experience on like half of his hero pool. He had that flexibility factor with zero falloff, much like Smurf, but was also a positive force and an easy guy to follow, kind of like Hottie. Someone had the amazing performances and the leadership factor to give this team a ton of consistency. Lots of other places saw pieces shifted around, but someone stepped up as the only tank player on the roster, and he hit an absolute bomb. The Philadelphia Fusion. It's pretty hard to go wrong with MN3 or Zest, but I'ma pick Zest personally. While MN3 seemed like a missing puzzle piece during the whole Carpe fiasco midway through this year, there were other moments this year where the team played at least decently with Carpe in. Also, Zest was just a beacon of consistency. MN3 was more so hot and cold. Zest was just very solid. He played a huge role across a variety of heroes, including but not limited to Genji, Tracer, Reaper, and Echo. Other guys might have had their explosive moments, but Zest was always on. He was the first guy in the APAC region to reach 1,000 final blows, and even made the MVP ballot. He was the leader of this team despite being a rookie, and mad props have to go out to him for playing such a big role in what made Philly so special. Looking into the Toronto Defiant, you could probably go with a couple of guys, but I for one prefer Hisu. He was their primary playmaker like 80% of the time, and his Sojourn and Ashe play were very huge for this team in their Summer Showdown run, and in general it felt like the only times they were winning was when he was popping off. Hisu was pretty much the man all year, and his team struggles in the playoffs kind of put the exclamation mark on it, no? It was just like Lip. The man was doing everything he possibly could to win, but his team could not stop getting in their own way. Can you really blame the guy for leaving during the offseason? Hisu is one of the league's least talked about stars, and he really needs to start getting some more credit. There is no way this Defiant team is a playoff team without him. That's all I'm gonna say. It's Hangzhou Spark time, and aside from the Shock and Dallas, I guess, this might be the easiest pick on here. Shy wins out every single time. Literally from day one until their playoff elimination, he was the main guy that this Spark team were looking towards to get that opening pick or have that huge pop-off in the clutch. And what's great is both the good moments and the hardships exemplify this. He literally got most of the credit no matter what point in the year. In the wins, he was the elite X-Factor Sojourn that was winning them playoff and tournament games, and in the losses, he was the only reason they'd be relevant. Shy was the heart and soul of this Spark team, and he probably needs a back brace after what he went through this year. Just to stay on the topic of easy picks, we're moving into Washington Justice territory where, even whether it be the original team or the revised one after the changes, the consistent standout is just gotta be Decay. He did whatever this team asked of him while still being that same hyper carry we've grown used to. The fact that he started as the Tracer player and flex, so to speak, then moved over to the Sojourn hit scan role with little to no fall off is unreal. He had one of the best final blow to death ratios in the league on a mediocre team and put up similar total numbers to players with much more playtime. Decay once again proved that he is the lone star on a sad Justice team. The Boston Uprising. Given the difference between when he started and when Boston's coaching tried to replace him, it would be a crime to not give this one to Punk. Boston literally did everything in their power to keep Punk on the bench, and whenever they did, they lost in epic fashion. Just look at the map record comparison from the end of August. Isn't that a ridiculous correlation? And it's funny because immediately after they started playing him fully again, they went 5-2 the rest of the way in the regular season. Punk was literally the hero and undeniable leader of this Boston team. He was the difference between being respectable and being irrelevant. I've never seen anything quite like it before. It's like a switch goes off when he's in the game or something. He makes his teammates around him better. That is what it looks like to be a true teammate and leader. Punk takes MVP to a whole new meaning. The Guangzhou Charge. While an argument could certainly be made for a lot of the new pickups they got during the mid-season, I'd say that Choi Se-wan was this team's MVP. If you look at the season as a whole, he was always an excellent performer. He always did everything in his power to give openings for his team, be it during the struggles or the second half resurgence. He had the dependability factor that you really want out of a star player. His Tracer and Genji were very solid, and he deserves a lot of credit for being flexible enough to play well on two different rosters essentially. Always dependable and always popping off. That's Choi in a nutshell. Moving into the Hunters, I may have a bit of a hot take. My MVP for the 2022 Hunters is Jinmu. Leave is obviously the star of this team, but given Chengdu's tough budget situation coming into this year, somebody else had to step up. There weren't a lot of backups on hand. Jinmu had to be the big playmaker outside of Leave to take this team to the promised land, or at least give them a chance. He had to be reliable. He had to have a lot of excellent performances this year. And, well, he did. He did a lot of it on the Genji like you'd expect, but also showed improvement on Tracer. It was by no means spectacular, but it was always a weak point of his hero pool in the past, so it was really good to see this from Jinmu and the Hunters. Jinmu had a lot of extra responsibility on his shoulders this year, and he did not let the pressure get to him. The Hunters needed somebody else aside from Leaf to do the hard carrying, and for a bunch of the time, he became that guy. The LA Valiant. While this team certainly benefited from a total team effort, I'd like to think that Becky had some MVP qualities in him. He was asked to do a lot as this team's primary flex DPS, and he kinda popped off. His presence was especially felt towards the end of this year when the Valiant tried to make their comeback. He put in a ton of work on Tracer and Echo and was arguably the team's biggest playmaker. On a team with no real stars, somebody has to deliver if you want to win games, and Becky stepped into that role rather gracefully. Probably one of the more underrated players of 2022. The man showed star qualities that this Valiant team desperately needed to be relevant. The Vancouver Titans are up next, and I'd say there's only one man that fits the description. Aspire. Whether it was when they sucked or after they started playing better, Aspire was a pretty good constant on this Vancouver team. Early on, it felt like there were times where his team would squander away opportunities in spite of his best efforts. We'd see the carry, but not the results. Then, once they became more competitive, he was the guy that would close out games or at least help keep them in a tight series. And I'm willing to bet you that the Titans maybe win half the number of games that they do without his constant pop-offs. Nobody else had the same consistency as him on this team on a game-to-game basis. Aspire was a rising star and the leader of this Vancouver team without question. The New York Excelsior. Another pretty obvious one, right? The only real MVP of this team on a consistent basis was Yaki. The NYXL were just not good this year, but without Yaki, they may not have even won a single game. Every victory or close loss had his fingerprints all over it. The amount that he carried on the Genji to no avail makes me feel really bad for him. He could put the team on his back as much as he wanted to, and it usually still wasn't enough. Like, it's actually insane to look at it. If it weren't for him, they probably would have never went to like any map 5s at all, and none of their games would have been interesting. And he especially sticks out during their wins even more, which goes to show that he is their everything. Regardless, Yaki was the lone bright spot on a pathetic team, so there's no other choice. And last, but certainly not least, is the Eternal. In a season full of pain, misery, and a roster swap, there is really no standout player to choose from. You can pretty much go with anybody and it just will not matter. For the sake of the video though, I'm gonna go with Dove. Considering he was the top performer in the team's lone win of this year, I'd say that's more than enough to give him the qualifications. With Overwatch being a team game, these kinds of videos are very up for debate, but I still hope that you enjoyed it nonetheless. If you did, and you want more just like it, consider hitting the like button and subscribing to my channel. And don't forget to leave your own list down in the comments below so we can continue the conversation. And until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.